was paper-based. So I went back for a master's interdisciplinary in computer science, started out at Programming 101 with a bunch of 18-year-olds, very scary, and went forward. And when I started my PhD was when I first heard of this term diplomatics. I am by no means an expert, but as I went through Dr. Durante's class, it struck me that diplomatics and object-oriented programming were really two sides of the same coin. And when I refer to diplomatics, I refer to Dr. Durante's definition of traditional diplomatics as the study of the genesis, forms, and transmission of archival documents, and the relationship with the facts represented in them and with their creator in order to identify, evaluate, and communicate their true nature. So it's really the study of the being and becoming of the record. And to me, again, I keep relating that back to programming. When you program, that is the becoming of a record. So I think there's some synergy there that really needs to be explored further, particularly when we start to move into the more modern diplomatics through the inter pares research that's based on the jurisprudence, the history, and theory of administration, and an extensive and centuries-old body of written reflection and experience, again, about the nature of records and the record-keeping practices in bureaucratic organizations. Because as we move into the more modern records in the digital age, it's already been mentioned many times that we're moving from this physical object to this conceptual data object. And it's that conceptual object that really, again, resonates with me very strongly, that's controlled by metadata and virtually combines content, context, and structure to provide evidence of some creator activity or function. So all digital records, everything that we look at and we touch, starts out using some type of structured computer programming language of some kind. A vast majority of them are using what's called object-oriented programming, and that is a very key concept that we're going to talk about. So these objects have attributes, they have values, and they have behaviors that are controlled through the creation of computer methods. And they combine together to actually form the entity, the object itself, these variables and these methods in conjunction. So we're going to get a little geeky with me, so please bear with me. It's gonna be a rough ride, but there's a bright light at the end of the tunnel. So object-oriented programming, again, used by most modern programming languages, Java, C#, Ruby on Rails, all OOP languages. PHP to some extent, C++, they're all moving to this. That it's really at its core simplified, comprised of classes, methods, and the objects themselves. And the reason they're doing this is because it's very secure. It lets you isolate data and control what can see it, what can modify it, and what can actually touch it and do things with it, so that you can keep it just within that program, or, and this is the important or for us, once created, it can be reused in other ways to create other objects of a similar kind. And it's this modularity that has a lot of benefit, because once you create a core object, you define its attributes, they can then be shared among other objects of the same kind. And these multiple methods can be combined together to create what we call an object. And when I say object, think record. It's that precursor of the record as it exists in the computer and it's doing its thing and thinking, it's an object. And then once it's finalized and represents it on the screen, we have that record. So what I'm proposing is we act on these things at that object level, so that we're creating these things with diplomatic concepts in mind before they even become that record. So object-oriented programming, the title says it all. Object-oriented. It's all about the object being created. It's not about the actions. It's not about the business logic. It's about what are we trying to create. What attributes does it have? What behavior does it have? Object-oriented programming asks those questions first, and then says, okay, now what do we do with it? So object-oriented programming starts with what the object should be, the ideal form. Sound familiar? We start with that ideal form and then say, what is the relationship of this form to another form? So it's as Corinne said yesterday, it's that conceptual layer. She talked about diplomatics at the logical. Let's talk about building diplomatics, the attributes, the data, the information that you need to perform a diplomatic analysis, and put it into the conceptual layer and bake it into that object. So, from my perspective and my understanding, with diplomatics, you look at all the extant records, and you try and distill that down to the ideal form to understand what their context of creation was. What is the ideal form of that record? Object-oriented programming flips that upside down and says, here is my ideal form, let's give it some data, now we have the records. So it's all about defining what this object is. We give them attributes that help describe, define, and control the behavior of the object. Control procedures of creation. And these objects are generalized into a class, where all objects of that type derive from that class. So think about, roughly, Plato's theory of form. A chair in reality is an approximation of an ideal chair. The ideal chair is the class. You give it data, you get the chair. You get that approximation in reality. So we have these classes, and these classes are important because they help give state and they help give behavior to these objects. They define all the objects of a particular type. So in this case, we're creating a public class, anybody can see it, of the type chair. And we start to define what are the attributes a chair has. Legs, back, material, upholstery. Those are the attributes we give it. But because we have this inheritance concept, so an object can be shared, an object can be extended, we can now also create a public class of a recliner that extends chair. So it inherits all the attributes of chair, plus, well, the back folds back, and a little footrest comes up. So it's everything a chair is, plus a little bit extra. And the examples I gave were public, but we can have these open, we can have them restricted just within our own environment, or we can have them private, so outside of that little program, nothing can see it. So we can control the procedures of creation so that certain attributes are immutable. Once we give it a value, it will never change, ideally. Where's Fred? No snickering. So the methods themselves are the way that we assign value to these attributes. So we define a method, I want this to happen. And that is how we act upon the object itself. And these methods are subroutines comprised of a sequences of actions that need to be taken. We have some input data, we do something with that data, and we have typically a single output. And we'll give an example of that shortly, 10 minutes. So in most object-oriented programming languages, you can have multiple inputs and given a single output. So it makes the logic on it very, very easy. I want this to happen. So these methods are what possess the logic that really drive how an object comes into being. How we add information, how we delete information, how we modify it, or how we peek. We just say, I want to know what this value is because I may need it later. And we do this all through the methods. So, how do we bring this together? We're talking about the conceptual, ideal object before it becomes a record. It's not a record yet, it's this theoretical thing floating around within the computer. What I'm proposing is we take some of these diplomatic concepts, the studying of the being becoming, and apply it into the creation of these objects. And so if you'll bear with me, I'm going to steal Jane's example from yesterday with the email to show you how these objects and this inheritance can work. So from a diplomatic concept, there are certain extrinsic and intrinsic elements that are universal to all digital objects. So we create this class called digital record. Very generic, broad-based. What are those things that all digital records have? They have a file type, create date, they have a writer, they have a program that created them, they have a version of the program that created them. then we create other classes that inherit not only the digital record, but add to it itself. So in the case, correspondence. Correspondence has a addressee, and it has a writer. And then from there, we can continue to inherit the properties. So we'll do social media, which I don't think is really record, but bear with me for the example. And then we also have email. And then for the social media, we also have different types of social media that have different attributes that can inherit continually up to extend that concept. Then we also have reports. Annual reports have to be distributed. They have to be sent to someone. So there's a form of correspondence there that we can inherit some of the properties from correspondence and build them into our annual report record. So it's all about this construction process. Continuing that email concept, we build a public class of email that extends correspondence. So it inherits all the attributes of correspondence and adds a few more. And so we're going to define what those extra attributes are. The addressee, the originator, the writer, the body, the subject, whether there's annotations, attachments, qualification of signature, those types of attributes that are unique to this particular type of email. Then where do we get these values? We control this. How do we get these attributes? Where do they come from? How do we validate them and know that they are coming from known trusted sources? We as archivists, as diplomatists, can help influence that. So we can get it from a file. We can read a file, pull some values out of it, stick it into this object. We can use the scanner keyboard and ask somebody to type something in. We can actually query the computer itself. Tell me what date you have. Tell me who's logged into that computer. Tell me whose domain that computer is on, so that we know who the author, who the originator is, what IP address are they using. So we can get these types of validation and authentication and build them into the object itself. So that we can now finally build our object. So we're going to create a new email object that we are going to preserve, that we're going to build some of these diplomatic concepts into, so we have the to, the from, the what is it about, the content, and when was it sent. And you'll notice I have the same method twice, because we have different inputs. So we can account for that. One of them has an attachment, one of them does not. One of them has a digital signature, one of them does not. And when we have these different variables, we can give them different behaviors. We can control this. We can build this in if we're comfortable talking to the computer programmers to say, look, almost all digital objects, digital records start as some type of an object in an object-oriented program. Scans, emails, Word documents, web pages, they all begin life as an object. And if these objects are supposed to be ideal forms of these representations that eventually become records, we've got a problem. I've managed coders for 7 years, and I can tell you without a doubt, they have no clue what they're doing when it comes to records. They don't know records, they don't know the process of creation, they don't understand what we need in order to authenticate them and preserve them over the long term. So they are not qualified to create these, yet they are the ones doing it. Fred spoke about the need for redundancy. We don't have to rely upon just what the computer says it was created at this time. We can embed that into the document. We don't have to rely on just that properties created by. We can actually query the computer itself and build that into the object. Corinne showed us yesterday how you can go into Microsoft Office and actually look at all the metadata. It's open. OpenOffice, Microsoft Office, Adobe to some extent. We can build these attributes that we need for diplomatic analysis into those objects that become the records. So the application of these diplomatic concepts to this conceptual record is really going to help us a lot. And we've already got a good start on this through the benchmark requirements and the baselining requirements and the application profiles created by Interpares. So the concepts there, we just need to start working with programmers to get those built in. So if you're not scared yet of all of this, there are some really unique opportunities for what we can do. Preservation begins at creation. We think that Interpares has been saying that for years, and I think we've shown that to preserve these records, we really need to start at creation. And you don't get any closer to creation than working with the object, by building in these concepts. So if we apply these diplomatic concepts, the structure, the rigor, as Fred said, the vocabulary, the concepts, into proactive record creation, not just of new digital records, but as we scan our own diplomas and charters, why do we not build the object around that so that all the diplomatic analysis that we do is embedded into that as well? So it's not just a TIFF image, it's a TIFF image with everything from a diplomatic analysis standpoint that we need as part of that record. So to bring the knowledge of creation that we have from the study of the being and becoming to influence the creation of these object-oriented methods that are used to actually construct the objects that become the records. So we move as far up the food chain as we can and say, you know what, there's certain things we need to know. Can you please, as you create these things, put them in those records for us? Because we may not need them now, but we're going to need them at some point. So this diplomatic approach to capture the elements will be important from a diplomatic analysis as part of that object, as part of that record in the future. So put it in now when we know it, when we can help authenticate it, when we can show the procedures of creation, and be able to prove at that point, this is what we know about it. Granted, there's always ways around that, but best case scenario, we do what we can. So the opportunities are there, and it's really becoming increasingly important because we're now at another paradigm shift. These records are increasingly being pushed out onto the web, where they're being created, used, maintained, accessed in a web-based environment. And so Interpares Trust is really starting to look at how do we trust these records? What does it mean to have trustworthy trustees? We have an opportunity because, again, we're now in a new paradigm. We're not working on our desktop. We're not working on the mainframe. Everything's getting pushed out there. We can control that. We can influence that so that we have a stronger focus on the trustworthiness of those records through the methods that actually create them, so that we control the procedures of creation. So that we move from metadata documentation into actually embedding this information into the record itself. And if we can't do that because it's proprietary, at least we create that metadata in a very controlled, consistent environment with a known vocabulary, so that we bake in the evidence that we need for diplomatic analysis that will occur decades or centuries from now into the actual record itself. So to steal a term from Luciana that came up over the walk here, we have a chance to become futurist diplomatists. Sorry, yet another version of diplomatics. So really quick, in my last 30 seconds, what does this look like? Let's see if I can bounce out of this. And so I am eating what I speak. So my current position at the Hawaii State Archives, we are building this object model, and we are trying to build some of these concepts into it. It's a little hard. Okay, it's totally not working. So you'll have to take my word for it. If you really want to see what does this look like as you build this object model, come see me. I can show you what it looks like as we're building these methods. A little bit slow, hold on. So that we can build in digital signatures, that we can build in querying the computer to say who is logged in, what domain is it from, so that we know about the environment, so that, as Fred requested, we build that redundancy in. We embed it in the record, plus we have all the properties that we normally would have for the record itself. So, that being said, hopefully you're not too scared. I think there's a great opportunity there to take your knowledge and help transfer it into the programmers that are building these objects, become the records that you at some point in the future will be wanting to reference and look at and question, are these authentic? What do we know about them? So here's some of the references for the quotes. and of course some of the websites that you can go to find out more about some of the archival diplomatics and the research that we're doing into records in the web. So, 21 minutes. Thank you very much.